All right, so before we start working on the rest of the structure of the coil pot, we need to start with our base. To do that, you're going to start with a slab. So I have already wedged out my clay. I got it back into this ball, and I'm going to create a slab now using this. So I like to start out by kind of flattening this a little bit. Just makes it easier to work with. You'll notice I already have my guides along here. The base of my vase that I chose to create does not have to be massive, so I don't need to roll this out really, really big. I am going to use the outside of my tape roll as kind of my guide to cut out that bottom. So use your guides, grab your rolling pin. If you need to stand up for this to make sure that you have better control, please do so. We want the base to be relatively thick. I would say, anywhere around a ½ inch is a pretty good starting point. And remember, even though we have wedged our clay, when we just rolled it out, we want to compress the surface one last time and just double check for any air bubbles that you might see kind of pop up as well. Make sure you take care of those in this process too. I grabbed my metal rib. You could use your wooden rib as well. It's personal preference. Again, we drag across our clay in at least 2 different directions at about a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to go this way. Just peeling off any excess that I pick up, and a second direction. Don't forget to do it to both sides of your slab. All right, double check that you can't see any spots that might have air bubbles within it. Figure out what you are using to trace the base of your coil pot. If you are freehanding the base, that's fine as well. I gotta grab my needle tool. And I am going to trace the outside. All we need here is the base. I have a bat here so that it's easy for me to transport around my house. Remember, this excess clay, we need to use this. So I'm gonna go ahead and re-wedge and get this back into a ball, and then I will show you how to move forward. All right, so I have re-wedged all of that excess clay that I had from cutting out the base of my vase. Remember that this should be anywhere from 1/4 to a ½ inch thick, and it should be the size that you need depending on the function of your vessel. So think about the size before you actually start cutting. I do have a quick line drawing of my plan for my vessel, and I drew it just a little bit smaller than my end pot the end size of my pot is going to be. So I have this excess clay. I have re-wedged it. And now I'm starting to get it into a kind of like a cylinder form. Just rolling it back and forth, making sure that these sides aren't punching out on me at all. Your next step is to begin to roll out coils. You're going to roll just the same way that we've been rolling whenever we've made feet on the bottom of our project. So like that foot that we added to the spoon rest. That started out as a coil. So we need to roll coils until they're about a ½ inch thick. So I'm gonna kind of go a little bit larger than my pointer finger. That's just kind of the gauge that I'm going to use. You could grab a ruler or a measuring tape if you want to, or just kind of imagine that 1/2 inch thick. So I am going to start rolling out my coils. As soon as I can, as soon as this gets wide enough, I'm going to begin using 2 of my hands, okay? If this is too difficult to start like this, we can use our hands and just kind of squish it into and compress it into more of a log form to start with, so that it's a little bit thinner when you begin to roll out our coils. We are going to use 2 hands. Your goal is to create coils of even thickness. And the easiest way to go about building a coil pot is to roll out multiple coils at once. And that way you can just continuously build as you go and you already have them ready. Otherwise you have to add a coil, build a coil, add a coil, build a coil. And it's easier if we can roll out a bunch of them, build them now, and then we can just add them to our pot later. So I'm going to go ahead and roll this out until I feel that it is about a 1/2 inch thick. If I start to stretch further than my little placemat will allow me, I might break this apart and go in 2 sections. Remember, you use 2 hands. I go from the tips of my fingers, or the finger pads, to the heel of my palm. You go forward in long motions and back towards yourself, and you'll notice that as I push forward, my fingers start to expand, and I contract as I go back. Okay, so go ahead and roll out your coil using all of that clay that you have wedged. And again, if it's too much clay to work with, feel free to break it up into smaller sections. All right, I have 4 decent sized coils rolled out to begin with. Again, they're around a 1/2 inch thick in diameter. And I have the base of my vessel on my working surface, wherever you plan to work. The next step is to begin attaching the coils. You're going to need a needle tool or something to scratch or score the surface of your clay, and you will also need some water or slip, so really watered down clay. So make sure you have those things handy as well. All right, the way that we attach our coils to begin to build our vessel is the same exact way that we have been attaching feet to our projects. So we score or scratch the surface that we are going to attach them to. So I am going to go into the base of my vessel, and I am adding in these little score marks. So I'm roughing up the surface of that clay, and I'm going to go in 2 different directions so that you're creating some sort of hash mark. And you're creating that kind of Velcro effect because we're going to do this on the coil as well. When we have two surfaces that are scored, remember, rather than clay trying to sit like this together, that Velcro happens and they're able to grab onto each other and have a little bit more integrity in the form, in the strength of it. So I'm going to grab one of my coils, my first coil. I'm going to scratch and score one surface of this as well. I'm going in 2 different directions. Just a reminder, when we apply water or slip to any surface, we do not dip our finger, we do not run it across the surface of our score marks, because that's just defeating the purpose of scoring. We are just like matting them down at that point. We want our water to sit in those grooves and on the surface of it. So I'm just dipping my finger so that it is saturated with water, and I am tapping the water onto the surface of my clay, okay, onto the score marks. as soon as you get water on both of your surfaces, we are going to start attaching our very first coil. Okay, so the way that we do that is we go scored lines against scored lines. I begin to place this coil around the perimeter of my base of my vessel. When I get to the edge or the end where my coils meet, if you remember back to the way we kind of cut our coils for our feet so that we were sure that they ended together, you can overlap your coil like this, and I can use my needle tool and cut directly through both of those until I reach my base, and that way I know my coils are going to end up flush with one another. So I take off the excess pieces that I just cut, and now my cut lines for my coils will meet up perfectly. So I have a nice flush coil there. You are going to begin to blend the seams the same way that we did with the foot of our spoon rest, but you want to blend it in areas that you want to blend. So if you want a seam to show on the outside of your pot, like if you want to be able to see individual coils as we build this, then you're going to want to just blend the inside. I do recommend, however, if you plan to use this vessel as anything that is functional, I highly recommend that you blend at least the inside, especially for this bottom coil. We need this to have really, really nice strength and be really, really kind of connected to that base. This is our building block. Remember, you can use your thumb or your index finger and your thumb to blend the seams. Otherwise, you also have this little wooden tool with your pointed end and the indented little rounded end. And this little rounded end is really nice to work on the inside of your pot to blend out any seams. So when we blend, remember, I'm gonna do this as best as that I can show you. You use your finger, you go about halfway through the coil, and we pull clay down into the center of our pot, or the starting place of our pot. So again, I place my finger or my thumb about halfway through that coil. I push down and I pull that into the base. So I'm going to go around and blend the entire inside seam using that same technique. Okay. All right, I have made it all the way around the interior wall of my vessel, and I have blended out that seam. So you can still see my finger marks. They kind of look like petals around there. And I'm also going to get rid of all of those marks. So that those finger marks, those indentations that I put into the clay by blending, I will get rid of them. I'm also going to, though, blend out the seam on the outside of my pot before I blend out my finger marks on the middle side. Okay, so I'm going to do the same exact technique. I start here, I kind of support the inside of my wall with my other finger or my thumb, and I just start to blend out that wall. Once I have blended all the way around both the inside and outside, I can no longer see any seams. Now I just see my fingerprints. I am going to begin to kind of smooth those out and get rid of those. You can add one more coil and then deal with the prints. I think I will do that as I move forward, but for this first coil, I want to make sure it's really, really solid and nice as a first step, so I'm going to take some time to blend that out right away. Another thing to be sure of is that you can get it off the surface that you're working on still. So sometimes it'll stick to this bat that I'm working on. If you're working on cloth or canvas, anything like that, you should have an easier time. All right, as you begin to finish up, kind of smoothing out your first coil or getting rid of that seam, one thing I want to point out is that you can use a rib, either this one or your wood one, to smooth out the exterior of your vessel as well. So that's sometimes a nice way to get rid of all those fingerprints and things like that. Once we have our first coil blended and attached, it's time to just add our second one on. One thing to think about, as you build your vessel, there may be a point in your vessel where you want it to start curving out or coming towards each other. So the walls are getting more narrow or like coming in, or they are spreading apart and moving their way out. Depending on what you want. If I want my vessel to go straight up and down, my coil is going to rest on top of the previous. If I want my walls to start forming outward, like in the direction of like away from the center, you want to wrap the coil towards the outside of your first coil or the previous. And the opposite can be said if you want your walls to begin to come in together. If we want that to happen, we would kind of overlap towards the center of our pot. Okay, so it depends on what your goal is with the shape that you're trying to achieve. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to slip and score both my coil and my pot here, and we're going to get the next one attached. Once you get your next coil attached, I am going to blend out the seam where my coil ends came together. And after that, we want to, again, if it's the look that you are going for, whatever kind of aesthetic you are trying to achieve, you are going to blend both the interior and exterior of your coil pot. One thing to think about is that you need to begin to support the outside or the inside as you work now, because we don't want to push too hard accidentally and our first coil collapse. If you continue building up and you're beginning to get kind of tall, if you feel like your clay is too wet to kind of hold its shape, if it's kind of beginning to feel a little wobbly, a little unsteady, you can take a blow dryer to it and help that drying process speed up. Otherwise, you can walk away for an hour or maybe, check it every 15 minutes until it is workable again. But I'm going to use either a finger or a tool, and I'm going to begin to blend out the inside and the outside. So when I blend the inside, again, I'm going to go halfway through that top coil, and you are kind of pinching downwards to smooth out that seam, or to just kind of cover up that seam. Like, we don't want it to really exist anymore. So and it kind of rotate your body so that you're comfortable working, but I use my fingers on the outside to support it because I'm working on the inside. You can use two hands. I just simply pull clay again, the same way that we did on our first layer, down to cover up the seam in the second. So again, I use my finger, I go halfway through the coil on the top, I'm supporting it with my thumb on the outside, and I am smoothing that down inside the middle of the pot. I'm going to go all the way around my vessel, and then I will take care of the outside. So once again, I have my finger marks creating kind of like those petals look to it all the way along the inside of my pot. As we continue to get higher, you're only going to smooth over one seam at a time. So I'm not going to, if I add another coil here, I probably won't pull all the way to the base. I'll only pull over my second coil. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm also going to get rid of the seam on the outside. So I have gone all the way around my second coil and I have smoothed out that seam. Before I take care of all of my finger marks, I'm gonna go ahead and add one more coil and then take care of all of those finger marks after 2 layers. All right, this is what I have going so far. That is my next coil. I have not smoothed out any of it yet, so I'm going to take some time to do that really quick. Remember, you can use your tools. You could use a sponge, you could use your wooden tool, you could use a rib. You have 2 different types of ribs, so you could try working with this rounded one, especially for the interior as you begin to get a little taller. You definitely could try something like that. I personally like to, or just kind of have a preference of using a kind of my thumb or my index finger. If you add a tiny, tiny bit of water and then just kind of rub back and forth across the surface of your clay, it will eventually begin to, where'd it go, smooth out like this one. So this is the process compared to where we started, the inside of our pot. So I'm going to continue to smooth out any of these surfaces. So I'm working around the exterior of my vessel right now, and I am working on just getting rid of all of these seams and these fingerprints that I had from blending. As you work, sometimes it is nice to give your clay a bit of a rest so that things can kind of stiffen up a little bit so that it can support more weight as you work. If you feel like you are getting any weak spots in your clay or in the walls of your vessel, you can scratch, score, slip, and add a fresh piece of clay onto any of those weak spots as well. So you can kind of reinforce these walls, same way that Mrs. Young had shown doing with our slump mold bowls. Okay, so same concept. You can patch any skinny parts as well. So it isn't by no means perfect yet. I don't like to do any kind of really, really solid smoothing until I get a lot more height before I'm kind of finished working for the day. So I have smoothed out the inside. I have the outside done. At this point, I'm getting to a height where I might want it to just kind of settle for a minute before I add another coil. But what I want to point out is if you were going to add a coil that is different, so if you were adding any decorative coils, I'm just going to thin this coil out a little bit. Let's say you are going to add a spiral coil or a row of spirals around your pot. All you would do is you would take this coil, figure out how it is going to wrap together. If you are worried about the integrity of kind of the strength of it, you can scratch and score between all of these places where it's going to make contact. And I am going to show you how to do that. So I would scratch here and then scratch as well where it's going to connect or kind of wrap around itself. Add a little bit of water or slip and just really kind of help this coil with its strength. So if I wanted to attach a decorative coil, such as a spiral, right? You can create this spiral out of any coil. You can go a little bit thinner than a ½ inch if that is what is required. If I want to attach this to the surface of my of the wall, I'm going to scratch and score any place that it's going to make contact with my vessel. So on the bottom here, I'm going to scratch and score on my wall as well. I'm going to add a little bit of water to the base again and to my pot itself. And I would begin to build them this way. You are going to want to blend the inside of where this connects because it is a fragile piece. When we start to add decorative pieces like this, I would use my finger or a tool and blend that seam so that just doesn't happen, right? So that we would blend that seam on the inside out really well so that that is non-existent, okay? We could continue to add these spirals all the way around our vessel if you wanted to. So you could have an entire layer, more of a decorative layer, on your vessel as well, okay? But what I am going to do is I'm going to let this chill out for a minute, and while I do that, I am going to roll out a couple more coils and get those attached in the meantime. All right, I've let my pot sit for just a couple of minutes, maybe 5 or 10, just to kind of strengthen up these walls, let them set for a minute. And in the meantime, I rolled out a few more really large coils. So I'm going to continue to build this until I get to the desired height and shape. Remember, if you want your walls to begin going outwards, I would wrap that coil around the outside of my vessel. If I want them to begin going inwards, I would place this kind of overlap it halfway on the inside of my pot as well. Okay, so keep those things in mind as you are working. Just realize I should check mine every once in a while because mine is pretty damp and I'm working on a surface that it likes to stick to. So kind of check the integrity of your walls every once in a while as well, and making sure that nothing is getting too thin in any area, that it's staying relatively even. When you continue to work, eventually you are going to get to the very top, the rim of your pot. That rim can be left as a coil on the exterior or it can be smoothed out. Just be sure that as you're working and you're getting ready to add that rim, you want to keep craftsmanship in mind. You need to maintain excellent craftsmanship throughout this. Really make sure that you're taking the time to put in those final details as you work your way up. So I'm going to continue to add just a few more layers so that you can see the process one more time, and we will go from there. So I noticed that I have a little bit of a weak spot here in my clay. I am going to take a little piece of fresh clay. I'm just going to make kind of like a patch. I'm going to scratch here, find my weak spot. I'm going to scratch there as well. So I'm going to scratch on my weak spot too. I'm going to add a little bit of water or slip to both. And I literally place this clay on top and patch it. I'm gonna use my hand or my fingers again to smooth this clay into the wall so that it's almost like it was kind of never there, or that patch was non-existent. Okay, so I added that patch. Remember, I am going to do nice final touches and things like that in a little bit as I continue to get some height, but I'm going to take care of the inside seam now here. So I already have my finger marks all the way across the outside, kind of patching. We're getting rid of those seams. So I'm going to do the inside now. I'm going to use my wooden rib on the exterior of my pot now that I'm starting to get some height. And you can see how you can use a tool like this to kind of drag it along the outside and really start to smooth it out. You get rid of all these bumps from your finger marks. You begin to get a nice smoother surface. Another thing that the rib is really, really nice for is that it is a squared edge. So you can use this flat against your working surface to drag it along the edge of your pot to make sure that you're getting nice kind of straight walls that are 90 degrees or perpendicular to your tabletop that you're working on. So the exterior of my pot, after I take a rib to it, it's beginning to look much nicer, much cleaner, but the inside of my pot still needs a lot of work. So what I'm doing here is I'm using this straight edge on the inside and I'm pulling it around that inside wall. So if you can kind of see here, I'm supporting the outside of my pot with my hand, and I drag this along that inside wall. It just kind of helps to smooth out that clay, and I'm making sure that the little curved end of this is not against the wall, but the flat, smooth edge of the back of this little wooden tool is against my wall. Again, you can use your hands for this entire process. You don't have to use any tools at all to smooth anything. I just think that sometimes we have them, we have access to them, they're nice to use. So I urge you to kind of try both, see which one you have a preference towards. Working with just your hands and a little bit of slip, or trying some of these metal or wooden tools as well. All right, so the inside of my pot is so far not perfect by any means, but it is looking much better. I'm gonna get another coil on there and continue the process. All right, I am starting to get some really nice height here. I have gone around the outside of my vessel and I have smoothed out all of my finger marks, things like that. I cannot see any seams at this point. The inside of my pot is not 100% smoothed out yet. I do need to spend a little bit more time doing that, but I do want to show you how I am going to begin to kind of start the top portion of my pot. So the top portion of mine is going to have this kind of curvature coming in towards more of like a bottleneck. So I just want to show you how I can begin to manipulate my coils so that they grow together rather than keeping these kind of straight or slightly outward walls that I have going on here right now. And sorry, I'm getting notifications on my desktop. So I have a few really nice long coils rolled out, ready to go. And I just want to show you how I'm going to begin to bring my walls together or closer in. So instead of layering my next coil on top of my wall like this, or directly on top like this, maybe you can see it a little bit better from the side, I am going to slightly set my coil on just on the interior of my previous row. So I will show you what this looks like in just a moment. And I'm going to pinch that off and I'll clean it up with my needle tool so that these come together cleanly. Again, just like we've been doing before. So if I join those two at the seam there, what I want to show you though up close is how I have kind of set this one inside of the last. So instead of having it sit directly on top, you'll see that there's a little bit of a lip around my new coil from the previous one. So I'm insetting it just a little bit. If I wanted my walls to go out, I would do the exact opposite. I would set it off just slightly outside of my previous coil. But I want my walls to come in towards each other, so I'm setting it this way. We will continue to blend the exact same way, however, but instead of pulling this top coil on top of my bottom, you also have the option to pull the previous coil up onto your new coil. And you can work either direction as long as you have enough clay in your previous row so that you have kind of that freedom to pull either up or down. But you can continue to pull this coil down as well. The important thing is that you get rid of this seam no matter how you choose to do so. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I am going to begin to pinch and pull just like this. So I pinch a little bit. I'm supporting the inside with my thumb and I am kind of rocking that outside clay up over my new coil. So I am pinching and pulling up over my new coil. Now, in order to be able to do this, this previous coil needs to still be very workable and it needs to still be really moist. It cannot be leather hard or anything like that. So if you have let your clay sit for too long, you are going to have to kind of bring it back to life with some water. If you've let it sit too long, you might need to score and add some slip as well before you do this blending step on this top layer. All right, so I'm going to continue to blend out my seam here. And then along with this, I will show you how we blend out the inside as well when we are layering coils, not directly on top of one another. Okay, so I have gone around. You can see there's a slight bend. They're going to continue to grow together as we continue to layer coils in that way. So I'm going to kind of figure out how I can point my phone inside here and show you how I blend the interior, and then we will continue to add. All right, I have gotten rid of the seam on the outside. I still have finger marks. I'm going to get rid of those once I add my next coil. But I just want to show you that I did get rid of the seam on the interior of my pot as well. And I'm just kind of rotating this, trying to show you what it looks on the inside as best I can. You start to see that we are getting a nice curve on the upper walls of our vessel. And I am going to continue that curve with another coil that will be slightly inset from that last one. So I am just kind of overlapping it. Maybe a quarter of the coil is sitting inside of the previous. I'm getting rid of this seam, and then I will show you one more time what that overlap should kind of look like. And remember, this can be used, the same exact technique is used for if we're bringing our walls together or if we're bringing them out. You just do the opposite. So again, this is how my coil is kind of sitting in that previous one, and I'm going to do the exact same step as before. I'm going to pinch and pull my last coil up over this new one. And on the inside, I'm going to pinch and rotate down into the coil before that. So I'm going to go ahead and work on this, and we will continue gaining some height and working on our vessel. All right, I am just using my thumb, and I'm going to go back and forth around the inside of this lip. Because it's starting to curl in really, really nicely, it's gonna be a little bit difficult to get one of our tools in. So sometimes you do have to just resort to using your hands, and that is the best tool for the job. Okay, so I'm just using my thumb, and I am trying my best to smooth away any of my finger marks that are still existing on the inside of this before the neck of my vessel, or that bottlenose kind of neck, becomes too narrow for me to even get a tool or my hand inside to work on. And I see a little seam down a little bit farther, so I'm gonna use my wooden tool here to just get rid of that as best I can. It's looking pretty good. And again, personal preference, you can use your hand or just like a little bit of water on your finger and get rid of your finger marks on the exterior of your vessel, or feel free to use one of your ribs. Again, it's whatever makes sense for your process and how you can work best. I do like to sometimes kind of add a little bit of water to my ribs. Every once in a while, I do just like dip it into my water, just a hair. It just kind of moves a little smoother across the surface of my clay. Especially when my clay is still wet like this, but I'm changing the direction of it. Sometimes we can get some weak spots, so you want to be able to smooth these things without applying too much pressure. So I'm always supporting my vessel from the inside while I do this. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. You never want to put too much pressure on the outside of your walls without supporting it properly from the inside. And I'm just using my thumb as my support on the inside. If you're getting any curved surfaces on your vessel, or you are creating any curved surfaces, such as this little arc that I have happening here, your metal rib is really nice because it is pliable. It is able to bend. So what I like to do is I like to bend it to fit the curve of my wall and just drag it across that surface, and it's going to create a really, really nice smooth surface if that is what your goal is. Try not to drag this across any surfaces if you have kind of decorative coils happening though. You want to keep those nice and clean as well. All right, I am going to add one more coil coming inwards before I begin to kind of work my way up into that bottle nose. And this one I want to really close off a little bit more, or a little bit more kind of exaggerated than the other two. So again, I am lining up my coils and I'm just cutting away that extra so that I get a clean, flush connection between my two ends. And I'm pressing those ends together, that seam, blending that seam out. This coil, I overlapped more than the previous two. So this coil, I'm getting very narrow in my opening, and that's okay. That's what I want, because I think that I'll make this my last coil coming inwards, and then I'm going to make the top of my vessel come straight up. So once again, we blend away our seams. All right, I have added my final coil coming inwards. I have smoothed out the surface of my vessel, as you can see, and this is kind of what I'm working with as that top opening right now. My next step is that my plan had the opening of my vessel coming straight up from here. So instead of adding another coil kind of underlapping or overlapping on the inside of my vessel, I am going to take my next coil and I am going to go directly on top of my previous coil, the exact same way I was building the body of my pot. So I overlap a little bit the ends so that I can cut through and get a flush sitting coil on top. And my coil here is directly on top of my opening. It is not underlapping on the inside at all. It is not overlapping on the outside at all. My goal is to go directly straight up with this coil. So again, now I'm going to begin smoothing the exact same way I was previously. So I'm dragging my top coil into the base of my vessel. So I'm pulling down here. And on the inside, I am going to smooth the top coil into the previous coil. So I am just getting rid of that seam, the same way that we built our entire base of our vessel. Remember to support your vessel from the inside, especially because we have this curve happening here that I don't want to collapse on us. You'll see that the neck of my vessel here is a little bit thicker than I want at the very end, but I am going to carve some of this away. So it's okay to add a coil and then carve away just like the same way we carve adding texture or anything like that. We have all of these carving tools that can give us really nice lines and pull away small amounts of clay as we add them. So don't forget to use those tools too. All right, I'm going to get rid of that seam on the interior of my pot now as well. As I'm working on the neck of my of the top of my vessel, I do notice that my walls here are still really wet. The bottom is nice and strong, but the top is a little bit softer. So when I finish this coil, I am going to let it sit for just a couple minutes, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and let the top just kind of strengthen up a little bit, get a little bit of air kind of hitting the surface of this clay, just so that I don't accidentally collapse anything as I add more weight. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and smooth out my new coil on the outside as well. All right, I have let my last 2 coils that I added on here, or 3, can't remember, I've let them sit for about 10 minutes. I now can feel that they are getting a little bit chilly, so I know that they're strong enough to hold a little bit more weight. So now I'm not so worried about my walls here collapsing that I'm adding this curve into. So what I also have going on is that you'll see I wrapped the base of my pot in some plastic. Because I have been working on this for so long and my clay has been exposed at the base for the longest because I built that first, I just want to make sure that nothing is drying out completely on me and that I can slow the drying process of that older clay a little bit more, just so that I can keep things kind of consistent and drying all together. So I'm going to leave this plastic on here as I begin to add just my last few coils, and then we will talk about adding a rim and any final decorative work that might be needed on your pot. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and continue adding my last few coils. All right, I think that I am at the point where I want my next coil to actually be the rim of my pot. So it is the very, very end of the pot. There are a few different ways to add a rim, or depending on how you want that rim to look, and I'll add a few of those photos into the video here so that you can kind of visually see what I'm talking about. But when we add our final rim, the most important part is that we have excellent craftsmanship. We take our time. We don't see indentations and things like that on the rim of our pot unless it's decorative. And I'll show what that might look like. But for mine, I really wanted, my goal was just a really clean line at the top of my pot. So what I need to be sure of is that I take enough time to really use my water, use my sponge, use my tools, get a really nice connection between this coil and my next, but then also be sure that that seam is absolutely non-existent at the end of it. Okay, so I have my last coil here. I actually want to work with a slightly thinner coil for this top portion just because I don't want a rim that is really bulky on this, and that's a personal preference. I could continue the same exact thickness as my previous coils and it would look fantastic still. It would all end up working really, really well and it would look nice and uniform. I just want my rim to be a little bit more delicate looking just because I'm going to add a few different features as well on my pot, and I think that it would go well with those other things that I hope to add. So I've just rolled my coil out just a hair thinner. I'm going to bring this back to center. Again, this coil I am going to layer directly on top of that last one. Here I'm just going for a little added height. I'm not going for anything curving in or out really. So I have my coils overlapped here, and again, just another reminder, an easy way to take care of the seam and make sure it lines up correctly is to cut through both coils at one time, and then you'll be able to fit that seam back together. So you are going through the exact same process again, one last time. However, this time, I'm probably going to take 3 or 4 times as long just to be really sure that I do a nice job on this, okay? So I'm going to fast forward through this one last time so you guys can kind of see the final product. At the very end of my piece, I'm going to let this top portion, once I smooth this out, I'm going to let it set for a little bit. And my very last step, once again, same thing we've done with our slump mold bowl and our spoon rests, and anything we throw on the wheel as well, is that we always end with a foot. So a form like this, I'm not going to be able to turn it upside down right away in order to add a foot. I'm going to have to let this strengthen up quite a bit before I'm able to add that. So keep that in mind. It will have to sit out for a little while or just kind of strengthen up, or you might have to work even on its side depending on the form that you've created, okay? All right, so I have added my very final coil to the top of my pot. I am working on the outer edges, just kind of getting those final touches, getting rid of any of my fingerprints, anything like that that I may have left. One thing, if you look closely at my pot, if I kind of sit up straight so that my dark shirt is behind it, it's kind of clear. The top of my pot is not perfectly flush. One thing you can do, or there are a few different things you can do, you could use a sponge. You could get a damp sponge, fold it in half, pretend my finger is the rim of my pot. You can kind of fold it like this and kind of run the sponge around the rim of the pot like this, and slowly but surely, adding very little pressure, we can start to smooth out that top surface. If it's too bumpy and you want it to be really, really level, you can use a needle tool to cut areas off. You could use one of your loop tools. However, if you're going to use a loop tool, I recommend that your clay is almost completely leather hard. Otherwise, it's really easy to kind of slip and accidentally cut too far into clay. One other thing that you could think about using is just a butter knife. A butter knife can cut through clay very smoothly, kind of effortlessly, and it's an easier, larger kind of piece of equipment that you could keep nice and level while you cut. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you are finished adding your top coil, you kind of finish out your rim, you clean it up, your next step is to go over your pot one last time and make sure everything is nice and even. Fingerprints are taken care of, seams are taken care of if they're not supposed to be there. Any decorative areas are really clean and well connected. You do not want to accidentally leave a weak coil anywhere on your pot, especially if you're doing like spiral coils or something like that. Make sure that they're all nice and connected. You have slipped and scored and smoothed all of those pieces together. And then after everything has taken a little bit of time to kind of stiffen up just a little bit, we still need to flip our pot over and add our foot at the very end of our piece. So we add our foot, and on the inside of that foot, or on the center of that foot, we carve our name and hour before we are completely finished with the project.